The National Student Financial Aid Scheme is under the spotlight tonight as students at various campuses continue to take to the streets since the beginning of this academic year, protesting against administrative inefficiencies and exclusion by the fund, amongst many other things. Good evening, welcome to Unfiltered. I'm Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh. Though the idea of free education is noble, given all of our country's challenges, is free higher education still feasible and sustainable? Joining us to discuss these wide-ranging issues are spokesperson for the National Student Financial Aid Scheme, Mr. Slumezi Skosana, Asive Dlanjwa from the South African Union of Students, as well as Rudie Heyneke from the organization Undoing Tax Abuse. Welcome, and let's dive straight into our conversation. Mr. Skosana, the National Student Financial Aid Scheme has come under a raft of challenges relating to maladministration. What is the scheme doing to avoid slipping further and further into disrepute with regard to these serious allegations of maladministration and indeed often corruption?
We do not hold the view that the scheme is sliding into any sort of dangerous zone in terms of maladministration and all that. Let me just quickly take you back so that you can pick up the context of what I'm trying to say. That is, there was a problem around 2017 when the scheme, for example, experienced unprecedented delays in processing applications, for the students, as a result of which the minister brought in an administrator. And then the administrator straightened quite a number of things, problems that the scheme was experiencing. And then following that, there was an intervention by the current minister, Minister Blake Nzimande, who then brought the new board as well as the new CEO to run the scheme. And since then, we have experienced tremendous improvements in the way the scheme is running. But what?
Well, can I just stop you there, because I'm aware of the background, but we do sit in a context where there have been massive student protests this year. There have been accusations about the maladministration of NSFAS, its inability to coordinate with universities. So while you may feel progress has been made, there still are some serious questions. Just at SCOPA recently, MPs used some very colorful language with regard to the scheme. So, I mean, it's not all rosy, is it, Mr. Skosana?
I think let me just clarify issues so that we don't confuse the SIU investigations with what is happening on campuses currently. Right now, the protests that are taking place at universities are taking place against the backdrop that I may not also fully understand. Oopsie, what could have happened?
We've lost Mr. Skosana, disappeared, but has returned, hopefully, like some of the missing funds. Mr. Skosana, you're back with us.
I'm sorry about that, Sizwe. I think it's automatic lights going off.
No problem.
But I wanted to point out something here, that in the beginning of the year, there was an accusation that NSFAS had not paid the universities, and as a result of which universities were not able to disperse the funds to the students, which was not the case. And it is still the issue now, which is recurring. For example, on the 31st of January, the NSFAS paid a tranche to all institutions in advance before we even got our own statutory tranche that would have come in now in April. And again, on the 6th of March, we did the same thing. And as I'm talking to you right now today, we signed off a disbursement of more than R250 million to the institutions. The surprise for me is because the arrangement with the institutions is that NSFAS would transfer the money to them, and then it becomes incumbent upon the institutions to relay the money or to pass on the allowances to the students. That is sometimes not happening for reasons still unknown to us.
Well,
so
we'll come back to that. I only raised those questions because you say the issues are delinked, but of course, the extent to which NSFAS is functioning as an organization and institution of good governance ultimately does feed into the student experience and the extent of student protests. I guess the question on maladministration and corruption, though, in my view, has been, you've done a clever thing in a way in making it all about the students who haven't paid back. But actually, there are some deeper questions about the institution itself and maladministration within the institution that lie behind the headlines about students not paying back the money that did come to light at Scopa.
Well, yes, but I think, Sizwe, it's important that you must contextualize this thing. The issue of certain payments having been made to students illegally or whatever, which was due in large measure to students misrepresenting or falsifying their qualifications, or rather their information during application. It's something that is separate from what you and I are talking about now. It's history. It's something that happened before 2019 when the scheme had not shaped up in terms of its authentication and verification processes.
But you have to still verify now. In order to get the money back, you need to be able to verify today. So It's also about how you're able to verify what happened in the past, in the present. And I think that's a key part of what Scopa was looking into, and indeed what the SIU was saying in its report to the committee. So it's not just about the past, it's also about the extent to which you can verify today and indeed in the future.
It is precisely the reason why I wanted to take you back, because I wanted to link that to the current situation, that before we would take the information at face value, which is information that any other institution in the world would take. For example, if I apply for admission at the University of Cape Town and I'm based in Pretoria, I would not physically go to Cape Town and present myself. I would send documentation such as my matric results, obviously, my ID with the relevant stamps that authenticates it. So what happened in that case, people would present documentation that is authenticated in the form of affidavits and so on, only to find that that is not true. But as a result of that experience, we then implemented other measures such as authenticating and verifying the information through other agencies such as your Home Affairs, your SASSA, your SARS, so that if somebody said that I am indigent, I do not have parents that can afford, they are below 350,000 threshold, we would check with SARS. And when a person says so-and-so is my guardian or my parent, we would check with Home Affairs whether that is the case. So that is where we are now. We are able to verify the information.
Okay. Mr. Heyneke, you have painted a slightly different picture as outer, having looked into some of the finances of NSFAS. Do you concur with this view that the organization is on the right path and that maladministration and corruption is really a thing of past administrations?
No, I cannot agree with that. We received information from various whistleblowers in this space, and that is why we launched an investigation into, the affairs of NSFAS. We also submitted prior applications to get information on certain tenders, on certain contracts and so forth, which we were denied. And on appeal, we were still denied. And we had to take a decision on, are we going forward with this? Are we going to challenge the denials of, giving us the information? And seeing that there is a SIU investigation ongoing, because of factors that's, affordability and so forth and timeframes, we said let's rather give all our support to the SIU and submit all our information that we received to them, the investigations that we have done. And I can tell you this, that if I can just give you a brief history of how we got here, is that in 2018 we got whistleblower information on alleged corruption in Services SETA. And when we went through the same procedure there, by application, were denied, and we took that to court. And 4 years later, we only received the information and we could carry on with our investigation. What we found is that there's networks of people, public servants as well as service providers working together, and the tender services SETA cost the taxpayer at the end of the day 166 million rand. For a similar service that they are delivering at NSFAS now, and that's the distribution of the student funds. And that's why we started to look in deeper and deeper, and we got more information from whistleblowers, and we could look at different tenders. And what we found, up until now, is not a good picture. It's not a pretty picture. And we are glad that the president signed a proclamation for the SIU to look into the affairs of NSFAS.
Right, and we will get into that in more detail and, of course, get your response, Mr. Skosana. But Mr. Dlanjwa,
yes.
What's your view on maladministration and corruption within NSFAS, and how do you respond to the conversation and the debate so far?
I think, obviously, for many years, we've been really critical of the health of the scheme and the extent to which it's able to provide services to the poor and the working class, because that is our interest. And obviously, there has been many issues of corruption as it pertains to NSFAS, and particularly in the past few years. We think, obviously, in the last few years, there's been quite less cases, one owing to what is evidently systems improvement. Like, for instance, one of them, which we definitely applauded, was the collaboration between other state institutions and agencies, such as your SARS and etc., to be able to verify and ensure that, at the very least, that the people who are funding, the people that were supposed to be funding 1, 2, there has been, as I said, less cases that have been reported of late as per corruption, because also through maybe the centralization of the disbursement process of student funding. However, there are still issues of concern to ourselves as the union. And one, it pertains to what we believe. In honesty, besides the systems that I've mentioned now, for the most part, the systems at NSFAS are not as strong as they should be. It is not an organization that you would not believe, if you look at its systems, you would not believe that it's the second biggest social funder after SASSA. For the most part, honestly, it could be much stronger. Many systems are in disarray.
Right.
And I also completely disagree with the spokesperson that these are two different things, because the ability to administer funding has a direct impact on the stability of our institution.
And we're going to come back on this debate and discussion after the break. Thanks for joining us on Unfiltered. We'll dive deeper into the questions of NSFAS funding and indeed free education when we come back. Stick with us. Welcome back to Unfiltered. We're discussing the higher education sector and in particular allegations of maladministration levied against the National Student Financial Aid Scheme. Mr. Heyneke, before I come back on the wider debate, is there any tangible evidence that you are privy to of actual corruption and maladministration, or are these just suspicions that you have based on circumstantial evidence?
Well, we received information. We did the investigation, and in our review, we can clearly say that there are irregularities, but we need to confirm that officially, and that we can only do with official documents that we receive from from NSFAS. So, but I do believe that, and we had multiple, meetings with the SIU, and we've discussed this, and we have handed our information. And obviously, for an institution and an agency like the SIU, it is much easier to get hold of those documents and to take the matter further. But in our view, we are confident that things are not, all well at NSFAS.
Right. Mr. Skosana, how do you respond to the way the debate has unfolded so far, particularly this idea and notion? And we're going to delve into Mr. Dlanjwa's useful distinction in many ways between corruption and maladministration and just inefficiency. But on this question of corruption and maladministration, attempts have been made to get information. It hasn't been forthcoming. The picture of a clean bill of health that you painted earlier on seems to be challenged by at least OUTA. How do you respond to that?
My response to that, Sizwe, is that now that there's investigation going on, I think OUTA is doing the right thing in providing whatever information that they have, to the SIU, to continue with the investigation. We welcome it. We are a public institution entrusted with public funds.
But sorry to interrupt on that. Why didn't you give them the information that they asked for? Why was it not forthcoming if you are indeed happy that they have taken it to the authorities?
I'm obviously not at liberty to answer that question because I was not privy, to the requests that he's referring to. But I guess if he followed the appropriate channels, to ask for that information, and given that we are a public institution and following procedures to get information that he needed, would have lended such information as necessary.
Let's discuss the question of the efficiency of the scheme, because that's the distinction that was made between overt and obvious corruption and actually the efficiency of NSFAS. Mr. Dlanjwa, can you just take us through what you alluded to towards the end of our first segment in terms of the extent to which the idea of the funds actually getting to students seems to be not happening in as smooth a way, especially at the beginning of academic years, as we would all wish?
Let me give you an example. So last year, just before the commencement of the academic year, the students had applied and NSFAS was ready to advance the funding decisions, but they could not because there was no funding. But in contrast to this year, the funding had already been concluded last year, already towards the end of the year for this year. So funding has not been an issue. And yet we saw student protest across institutions. And that speaks to what I'm saying, that it's not necessarily a lack of funding, but the NSFAS with institutions, there is a level of, one, they are discoordinated. We have said one of the root causes of the challenge that we are facing is the failure, and it's unfortunate that you've got the students and you've got NSFAS and the department is not here, because in all honesty, these are public institutions. This is a state entity, NSFAS, and they are all under the tutelage of the Department of Higher Education. They've got a responsibility to coordinate, which to where I'm going right now, that you had all these institutions, public institutions, so you had NSFAS saying, no, we will advance funding decisions. There is the money, but we'll advance the funding decisions on the 25th of February. Not that happened in the end of February. You had institutions that are saying, no, we are closing our registration mid-Feb. You understand? So you begin to see, this is one of the things that cause the problems and the inefficiency that we speak about. Between NSFAS and the institutions, through the leadership of the department, they should have already, in the meetings that we had towards the end of the year last year, coordinated and ensured that there's a coherence in terms of their systems to be able to ensure, because we appreciate that NSFAS is funding the poor and the poor and the working class. So these are the things that we are speaking about, that the funds are there, but the students last year, as we are speaking, even some of them this year, you would find that they do not have money for food. SMU, 3 weeks ago, they did not have food for some of their students, did not have, their accommodation was not paid, food was not paid, and yet the money is there.
Right.
And then when you find that there is no coordination, and NSFAS, as I have said before, it's almost like there's no capacity to deliver on the mandate in which that they have.
Let's put that to Mr. Skosana. This question of there being money in the system and the political decisions being taken, but the actual implementation of this, especially at the beginning of academic years, seems to have a lot of friction. This only intensifies the incentive to protest. There seems to be something going wrong with the disbursement of the funds, even though the money has been made available, Mr. Skosana?
Yeah, I think, Sizwe, that is going to lead us to another discussion on how we are responding, to that problem. Because what has happened historically is that NSFAS would transfer the money, for example, to institutions such as universities. And then the universities will then disperse the money, or rather the allowances, to students. And due to the difference in administrative capabilities and capacities, some institutions would just not do it efficiently. So then last year, towards the end of last year, we then took a decision to say, can't we at least assist some of the institutions that have admin capacity problems and actually do a direct payment of these allowances to students. We are currently piloting that, and that seems to be the solution that we're gonna go with, because as it is, the communication between NSFAS and the universities, like Mr. Dlanjwa correctly points out, has not been candid, because we would give the money to the institution, and then the institution does not give the money to the students, and the students start protesting and saying that they are told NSFAS has not transferred the money. At some point in the past, Sizwe, I have taken unprecedented steps of even asking the finance department to print me out a proof of payment that so much money was transferred, so that I can see it with my own eyes, because of the situation which was prompted by the vets protest, where we were said to have not paid allowances. Let me just explain this quickly, Sizwe, with regard to the allowances. What happens is that there is a misalignment, between the commencement of the academic year as well as the time when we actually get our allocation as NSFAS, which is, the fact that at the beginning of the year, the students in January, February, and March are already on campus, and at that point, we would not have received our first tranche, which comes in April of every year. So, but what we did in trying to ameliorate or to deal with that problem, we then came up with a system of giving the institutions 20% of what they had invoiced totally, in total last year, so that the students are not affected by this misalignment.
Right.
Which is on the 31st of January, we already had transferred the monies to the campuses.
Okay.
So the delay, if I can just finish off on this point.
Sure, because I want to just round off this point.
All right, the last two tranches that we paid were now no longer monies that had to do with allowances as such. It's monies that had to do with tuition. And for us to be able to pay these institutions for tuition, we need registration data that confirms that the student is registered for a particular program, and that particular program cost so much.
So there seems to be still quite a lot of friction in the system between the department, NSFAS, and then the institutions themselves, and probably financial intermediaries in between. But let me take this question of the coordination and communication between the players in the sector further, because one of the allegations is accommodation providers. So these private players that are providing students with accommodation, and how they have wreaked havoc on the sector. Mr. Heyneke, talk to us about contractors in the sector? Because this seems to be at the heart of some of your worries and allegations.
Yes, with regards to the private accommodation, we spoke to some of the accommodation providers, and I think the one question that came in this year was obviously the cap of 4,500 Rand a month. And some of the providers say that, if you must fulfill all the requirements, the standards that's put out there by the department that was published, I think, in 2017 already, it is difficult sometimes to let out that accommodation for 4,500 Rand a month. I don't want to get into the debate if that is viable or not, but what I do want to say is, once again, the payment system to the accommodation providers, and what we've been told, and we unfortunately did not have time to look into that, very carefully, is that NSFAS appointed 4 payment partners that will pay the allowances to students, but we hear now that they will also facilitate the payments to the accommodation providers. Now, I think just to come back to the allowances first, is that in November, I think, last year, the NSFAS bank card was launched, or early in December, but it was in the last quarter of last year. And it seems that if you don't get this card, you will not get your allowance. Now, I do believe, and I think that NSFAS was not very honest with the students. With the launch, the CEO said, but this card will be comparable and just as good as a bank card with any of the commercial banks. If you look at the fees of this card, 29 Rand a month, a standard fee, and what you get for that, and you compare that with the banks, you can see that it is not the case. Now, this was a very good and a clever invention from NSFAS side, because now the service provider is getting paid by the student. And from NSFAS side, it looks good because they don't have this huge expense in paying the service provider. But if you look at it collectively, 29 Rand, let's talk about 1 million students that's funded by NSFAS annually. Per month, we're looking at 29 million Rand that goes to a service provider. If you look at the 10-month academic year, it is, and it's more than 29 because there's some extra fees that they will that will come on top of that. Let's say it's 40 Rand per student. You look at 40 million Rand a month. You look at over the contract period of 5 years, you're looking at 2 billion Rand. You know what we can do with 2 billion Rand? How many students we can fund with that? And there's a solution. I mean, this tender went out 3 times. And only on the last round, the third tender that goes out, this 4 service providers, tendered. With all the other guys, it was commercial banks, they tendered. And if you think about it, the public service, they've got a salary payment system that is working. It is a payroll, and they pay the employees more than 1 million every month. Why can't a system like that? Because I don't think that it is anything else than a payroll system.
And we will come into some solutions. We're going to take another break and then come back and discuss the wider question of free higher education and the extent to which that goal has in fact been achieved since the system shifted to a new model in around 2018. Stick with us. We'll be back after this break. Welcome back to Unfiltered. I'm Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh, and we're discussing the question of the National Student Financial Aid Scheme and the extent to which the promise of free education has in fact been realized in practice since 2018. Mr. Dlanjwa, in terms of the Union of Students, do we have free education as we speak, as it is often sung from the rooftops that this has already been achieved?
We've come a long way, Sizwe, I will tell you that much, because if you look at before 2018, if you look at the number of students that could access the sector vis-a-vis now, right now, based on the threshold alone, more than 90% of households can have access to institutions of higher learning. And before, it was deplorable to think of it, So I think we've come a long way if more than 90% of households can have access to the institutions of higher learning. Do we have free education? We don't, because we still have the missing middle. Missing middle are also children of the working class, and those students are still not able to access institutions of higher learning owing to a student funding model that does not cater for them. Number one. Number two, you've got postgraduate students. Now, there are certain qualifications where if you've done your undergrad, it's not enough for you. If, for instance, if you want to be a psychologist, clinical psychologist, you would have to have your master's. So we've been able to get them in the door and to be able for them to get their undergrads, but we're not able to carry through the promise, because the promise of free education is not the promise of student card. It is the promise of improving the livelihoods of our people and ensuring that they can participate in the broader socio-economic project of the country.
So you think it should be expanded beyond the 350 threshold and also into the postgraduate sector?
That would also be a cheap answer, because there are many issues that speak to free education. One of them is the quality of education that they are receiving, the extent to which when they leave, we have funded for them to get into the institution when they leave, the extent to which they're able to participate almost immediately in the socio-economic project. So because just funding and throwing money is not necessarily, that was not what we foresaw. What we foresaw was that the curriculum itself would respond directly to the plight of the poor and the working class. So that is another issue.
On the funding question,
yes.
What's your response to the feasibility question? Because, even compared to 2015, the economy's in a slide, recession. Who knows how much we need to spend to bring electricity back to just stage 2. The issue, in some ways, feels different now to how it felt in 2015, because the country is so much more on its knees in many ways.
No, that would be a reactionary way of looking at it, Sizwe, because right now, this is exactly when we need higher education, because one of the things that higher education will allow us is to be able to upskill, reskill and skill our people to respond to what are now the prevalent conditions that are affecting the economy. You can't, when you are faced with a socio-economic challenge, you then withdraw and retreat. This is the time exactly to advance and invest very critically and aggressively in higher education. It's an issue of priority. The feasibility question is a very cheap question, because it's an issue of priorities. What are the priorities of government? And if we believed and listened to the feasibility protagonists, we would not have more than 90% of households having access to higher education, because we were told even 2015, 2016 that no, that is not possible. And right now we have it. So it's really just an issue of the priorities of government, number one. Number two, to appreciate and what really is the role of higher education in terms of building the nation and building a developmental state. If we understand that, we will now know this is not the time to retreat. This is the time for us to look into that. We are spending billions of rands in the sector, and yet we are not getting the return, and we are crying about the economy. To what extent can that investment that you are making year after year respond directly to the socio-economic challenges and the issues that you are raising?
Mr. Heyneke, where do you stand on the philosophical question of whether free education is right? Because some critics of OUTA might say, you're just looking to poke holes to weaken NSFAS under a broader agenda of actually weakening the idea of free education. Or are you in support of the wider aim for free education?
I think it's affordable. And I need to qualify the answer, but I want to add on to what my colleague said around the cheap question, the money, the feasibility. If we eradicate the wasteful, irregular expenses, not only at NSFAS, if we look at the broader higher education department,
let alone government itself.
Let's stick with higher education here. I'm going to quickly give you 2 results of things that we found in our investigations, where a certain institution paid 302,000 Rand to brand a tender box. Now, it's ridiculous. Where an institution paid 214 Rand for an exam pad, because prices were just loaded, CFOs and CEOs just signed off, and the money went out of the system, into the pockets of the service providers. And if we can curb that, I can tell you now, and what I've said before, the figures that I gave you with regards to a direct payment system and the commercial banks. If you put all that money, into one basket, I can tell you now that maybe we will be able to reach that middle class.
Mr. Skosana, I guess the question then around the deeper philosophical debate is, well, to be honest, there's no more missing middle in South Africa. The missing middle is a thing of the past. Why not more? If things are going as well as you say, why don't we improve it from 350 to 600,000? Because families are struggling more now than they were in 2015. What are the chances of that happening, and why hasn't it already happened?
Well, in responding to your question, Sizwe, let me start by saying that I believe there is free education. And I believe that free education is sustainable, at the moment. If we have been able to give bursaries to almost 1 million students over the past 5 years.
Do you think an expanded model of 600 plus maybe postgrads would be feasible and affordable?
That I would leave to government policy makers, because my justification for saying that it is sustainable and it is happening as it is derives from the fact that the government took a policy decision to say that we are focusing on the poor, on the children of the poor working class. And, to that extent, they are able to do it. The government is able to fulfill, that policy imperatives. But if you were asking whether, the threshold of 350 should be pushed up or not, I would want to refer, to a study by the University of Cape Town, Liberty Institute for Strategic Studies, where they were indicating, the fact that there are 3.4 million people constituting the black middle class in the country, which was an insignificant entity 29 years ago when the new dispensation came in. Now, when you look at who constitutes the middle class, according to the write-up, would be somebody that earns 22,000 rands, per month. And if you multiply that by 12, you're not going to get more than 350,000. So which means that almost everybody in the country would be eligible, to be funded. And yet, there was a study that was conducted, against which maybe former President Zuma moved against, that said the country to have free education in full would require 400 billion per annum. And South Africa is not geared in terms of its tax base to be able to pay 400 billion, per annum. So in terms of the policy direction that the government has taken, yes, indeed, there is free education. And so far, it is affordable.
Well,
and sustainable, yeah.
Thank you for that. Let me thank you, Mr. Skosana, and our guests for a fascinating debate and conversation. You've also given me my next guests, the department, the banks and the universities. So we'll have part 2 of this conversation. We learned a lot today about accusations of maladministration leveled towards NSFAS, about its contractors and the way that private parties are undermining the system. And in due course, we'll learn more about the question of free education. Let's go to a break and wrap up our concluding thoughts after that. Welcome back to Unfiltered. We're in a discussion about the National Student Financial Aid Scheme, and we've moved on to deeper questions about higher education. Mr. Dlanjwa, from the union perspective, you were suggesting that it is affordable, but this question of 400 billion to the fiscus, do you agree with those figures? What's your view on the extent to which expanding to more students in the income bracket as well as postgrads would actually be affordable? So 400 billion, do you agree with that?
No,
that
there's
figure?
no such thing. And in any case, we appreciate that we are a developing country. So it would not make sense to fund everyone in the sector. So I think that the spokesperson there is just playing games with us. You see, what you suggested is what we agreed. And a number suggests that it is possible, the extent to which we can increase the threshold from 350,000 to 600,000, number one. Number two, we've even proposed a more comprehensive model that speaks to maybe from a certain, let's say from 450,000 to 600,000, it not be a full grant, even if it's a loan of some sort, because what we want is that they must have access to funding. We appreciate that there's no pitless, where we can get money from.
Have you costed that new proposal? So how much do you think that would cost, whether it's feasible or not?
Yes, I just don't have the figures now with me, but we have, for many years, we have looked at the funding models, as I'm saying, and they are more than feasible. In fact, in the MTT report...
Aren't the figures important, though? Because we
No, the figures are absolutely important, and I would not speak this to you and millions of people unless we had done the feasibility. I am not wish casting. I am speaking of the thing of homework that we have done. In fact, to the MTT report of the minister that speaks into this comprehensive funding model, these are some of the things that we had suggested that even found expression in the MTT report, and they were accepted as recommendations. And also to the extent to which the private sector can then come in to be able to offset some of this cost, because the cost, some of the benefit, the biggest beneficiary of this education, by the way, is also the private sector, and they have not necessarily been forthcoming in terms of this issue. So between the private sector and a more comprehensive model, loan vis-a-vis grants, because it doesn't necessarily have to be grants, it could be loans, you understand? And we even propose government-backed loans working with the private sector. So it's more than, it is a more than feasible solution. We have presented these models to the state, to the government. It is just an issue of us having the agility and the government will to do it, because even at the recommendations of the MTT report, they were accepted. So it's not like it's something that is just wishful thinking that we are speaking about. So the 400 billion, no, Mr. Skosana, he maybe had a long day. It's not an issue, really. There's no one who's speaking about 400 billion here.
Mr. Heyneke, you say you think it's affordable. Do you think an expanded model is affordable? And have you thought about how much that would cost? Or do you think the current model is the one that should continue?
To be honest, we haven't, looked in specific models for funding. I must actually agree with my colleague here that says it should not only be a grant. It can be a loan, but make it feasible. Make it attractive and make it worthwhile for the students. One thing that I do know and what I'd want to say is that if we start to import good governance in higher education, and as a matter of fact, in the whole education department, basic education included, and if we curb corruption, if we are transparent, transparency is the enemy of corruption, then we will have more money available for more things. If it is to fund students, if it is to eradicate pit toilets at primary schools, then we will have the funds, because the funds are there. Education is the second biggest budget ticket in the country. So the money is there. It is about using it and not abusing it.
Mr. Skosana, so the 400 billion figure has been disputed. We don't know exactly how much an expanded model would cost. I mean, so let me give you some figures and see what you think of them, because it seems to me that an additional 45 billion, not 400 billion, would actually take us quite far, because our current allocation is 45. If we were to expand
it's 47.6 billion right now.
Sure, okay, give or take a few billion. If we say average cost is about 55,000, or if that's the amount you're going to spend, including textbooks and all of that, then
average cost of
then I mean another 45 billion a year rather than 400 would actually take us quite far, wouldn't it? I don't know where the 400 comes from, but I think I think there may be fiscal space for expanding into the missing middle? I guess that's the extent of my question.
Okay, no, Sizwe, on the issue of the 400 billion, let me ask Asive Dlanjwa to go and read the Commission's report, the HERS report, that was presented to former President Zuma when he, took the decision that he took. He was presented with two options. There was one option that was saying that 400 billion will be necessary to give free education in South Africa as a whole. And you must remember that the education and training sector worldwide is estimated at $3 trillion US. I'm talking about a sector that is responsible for selling knowledge here. So in terms of what is needed to do it, you need a lot of money. And I'm not disputing the facts, the other issues and opinions that Mr. Dlanjwa is mentioning as to what we can permutate and combine, to come up with a sustainable funding solutions. But I'm just trying to highlight, the fact that it would require a lot of money to go completely free. But I'm highlighting the fact that the government took a policy decision that to implement a free education, at least at this point in time, we are going to focus on this category of people, the poor working class, who would not be able to afford to pay for this education, even if they wanted to. If you're talking about a cleaner that earns 5,000 rand, if you're talking about a domestic worker that earns 3.5 per month, there is no way in heaven that such a person would be able to pay 150,000 rand for a BCom degree at Wits University.
I suppose the elephant in the room, though, on the actual costs, I really think 400 sounds massive to me, and I dispute some of the HEFA Commission's findings, is the universities themselves, because aren't you in danger of just throwing money and saying you're going to fund students, but universities then just deciding, well, they're just going to escalate their fees because they know that that money will come in. So the cost is also about how much the universities are actually being given liberty to increase the cost. And we know that cost often goes to vanity projects rather than the actual education of students.
Well, we derive our mandate, from the Constitution. And Section 29, subsection 1A of the Constitution says that everyone has got a right to education, adult basic education, as well as further education, and that the government must take reasonable steps to make sure that education is accessible and available. And NSFAS is one of those measures through which the government attempts, to make education accessible and available. That is why, as NSFAS, we are stepping into terrains that we would have been unlikely to step into, such as accommodation, right. Because I want to highlight this point, why we're getting into accommodation. Because we realized that people were comfortable asking for a student to pay 90,000 rand per annum, which is like, let's say, 9,000 rand per annum for a room to study, when you can get for the same amount of money a 3-bedroom apartment somewhere. And NSFAS is paying over 13 billion rand just on accommodation alone as a component of the funding solution. So we are saying, no, in order to live up to the expectation of our mandate of making education affordable and accessible, we must do that. That's why we came up with the 45,000 cap, which was based on the research that it is possible to get good accommodation for a student and make education accessible to a vast majority of those that need it.
Okay, and we're going to just look into social media because there have been a number of interventions on social media through our conversation. We just want to look at what some of you, the audience, have been saying. Mzala says, yes, NSFAS pays universities and colleges in advance. However, what they're not telling you is that universities can only pay upon receiving the list of funded students. This delay in providing universities with the list is at the center of the delay in payment. Pablito says, fully funded NSFAS students are at risk of being evicted, homeless, compounding to the current shortage of housing because Mandela University has failed to pay housing service providers from 2022. Misuse of funds or just illegal activities Mandela University covered up. And thank you very much for your tweets. We'll continue this conversation on social media. I'd like to thank Mr. Skosana for his time. Mr. Dlanjwa, Mr. Heyneke, thank you for your insights and your interventions and for fielding the questions. Thank you very much for joining us again on Unfiltered, and we'll see you for the next installment. Have a good evening.